Друзі, ще раз рада вас всіх вітати на нашому першому вебінарі, першій події серії заходів освітніх для експортерів і для бізнесу, яка називається «Експерт Токс». Серія даних освітів сьогодні для вас виходить і виходить безкоштовно завдяки нашим партнерам Ukrainian Business and Trade Association, за що ми їм дуже вдячні, у співпраці з Berlin Global Advisors and Covington & Burling. Сьогодні з нами будуть фахівці і експерти з 5 країн. Це Польща, це Франція, це Італія, це Нідерланди, Німеччина. І вони зможуть вам з перших вуст розказати, що наразі відбувається в країнах Євросоюзу, все, що пов'язано з обмеженнями логістики, а також транзиту товарів в Євросоюз, а також переміщення осіб до Євросоюзу. Сьогоднішній захід буде модерувати Назар Бобіцький. Назар є директором брюссельського офісу Ukrainian Business and Trade Association. І для того, щоб зробити цей захід максимально продуктивним і інформативним, я би хотіла наразі передати слово Назару. Назар, будь ласка, the floor is yours. І побажати успіху, а також всім продуктивного вебінару.
Дякую дуже, Тетяно. Доброго дня всім. Ми раді вітати наших учасників на цьому вебінарі. Мене звати Назар Бобицький, і я є директором Брюссельського офісу Української асоціації бізнесу і торгівлі. І сьогодні ми поговоримо про те, яким чином нашим експортерам необхідно діяти, варто діяти в цій новій, незнайомій для всіх нас системі координат міжнародної торгівлі, в якій точкою відліку є коронавірусна пандемія по всьому світі. Під час нашого вебінару ми обговоримо 3 блоки питань, які цікавлять наших експортерів. Зараз я виведу для нас всіх презентацію, в рамках якої ми будемо працювати. 3 блоки питань. Перше – це стан економіки в ЄС, європейському ринку, і перспективи виходу з кризи. Друге – це обмеження руху товарів і людей, які зараз є чинні на європейському ринку, а також кроки щодо поступового виходу з карантину. Ми розглянемо ситуацію як в ЄС в цілому, так і по окремих країнах, які ключові для нашого експорту і транзиту. А саме Польщі, Німеччині, Нідерландах, Франції та Італії. Наш вебінар буде проводитися англійською мовою, і після закінчення презентації наші експерти нададуть відповіді на найбільш актуальні з понад 60 питань, які ми отримали від аудиторії під час реєстрації. Хотів би ще раз також наголосити, що це є перший вебінар з серії вебінарів, які Українська асоціація бізнесу і торгівлі планує спільно з Expert Promotion Office і іншими партнерами впродовж травня і червня, присвячений саме підтримці наших експортерів на європейському ринку. Для нас дуже важливий ваш фідбек, ваші коментарі, ваші побажання щодо тем, напрямків, країн, які вас цікавлять. Тому ми запрошуємо вас надалі стежити за нашою Фейсбук-сторінкою, а також за новинами і анонсами на нашому вебсайті за адресою ubta.com.ua. Now I have a pleasure to welcome our experts. Atli Stannard will share with us information about the EU and the Netherlands. Atli is a senior European policy advisor at the leading international law firm Covington & Burling. Marek and Stanislav will talk about Poland. Marek is a chairman and Staszek, director for intelligence at SEC Government Relations. It's a leading Polish independent public affairs company. Philippe Magnier will talk about France. Philippe is a president and co-founder of Via Solis Communications, a leading French company on the reputation strategic communications public affairs. Ralf Welt will talk about Germany. Ralf is a senior partner at Berlin Global Advisors. It's a leading German business consultant on geopolitics and government affairs. Roberto Musnecci will talk about Italy. Roberto is a co-founder and senior partner at Serban and Musnecci Associates. It's a market leader for public-private debate sector on healthcare, energy, and fast-moving consumer goods. Atli, we start with you. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazar. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today. I've been working, as Nazar well knows, with a number of Ukrainian companies for many years now on trade matters, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak a little bit on the impact of COVID-19 on Europe today. This slide is essentially to give you a sense of the economic impact in Europe overall. You'll see on the left-hand side, there's a graph, lots of figures. Essentially, what this tells you is this year is economically very painful in Europe. You have a contraction of 7.4% expected in the best of cases for this year overall. And even with an expected growth of 6.1% across the board in Europe, which is unusual, we will still be poorer than we were in 2018. On the right-hand side, you have some forecasts from the IMF on what might happen if the COVID-19 outbreak is longer or worse this year or recurs next year. And that suggests that we may still be in a significant recession next year of up to 8%. That is painful. What that means for you is that consumers in Europe will have significantly less disposable income, even for essential goods, and governments in Europe and businesses in Europe will also have much less money. Governments will be trying to support business and individuals, but their purses are limited. Now, this slide is very simple. It's to, again, trade, which is extremely important for Ukrainian companies, is significant. So the drop in imports into the EU is expected to be just under 9%. That's 240 billion euro less. A chunk of that will be Ukrainian imports, unfortunately. Exports from the EU, which are also important in some cases for Ukrainian businesses relying on such exports, are also expected to drop, in fact, to drop more than imports by 9.2% or 285 billion euro. This is one of the biggest impacts on trade we've seen since records have been kept. So what has the EU done? Well, we've tried to split the areas in which they've acted into two. One is on policy. Here, principally the EU has been looking out for businesses within the EU and countries within the EU. The Commission has played very much a coordinating role. There's not that much that is of direct relevance to the citizen every day, other than guidance, which we will come on to. There are a few emergency technical measures that the Commission has taken in customs, for example. We'll touch on that later, but also in agriculture, such as allowing or supporting the storage of certain agricultural produce. But again, this is only for EU producers. The Commission is, however, under pressure from EU business to protect what they see as their market. So far it has resisted it, but I must say there is a risk that the EU will consider, for example, safeguard measures on specific products. That is unfortunate and may not be entirely useful economically, but there is significant political pressure from some member states. So then let's look at the economic side. You have quite a lot of work which is around making sure that governments have enough money. That's what the European Central Bank is doing, essentially. There will be some support from companies coming from the EU level through the Future Recovery Fund, but this hasn't yet been fully agreed. And it will almost certainly be directed towards those sorts of companies which are genuinely part of, for example, the green sector. There is finally a fund that the EU has established of 100 billion euro to support temporary unemployment schemes in the member states. This is interesting perhaps to you because minimum level of income for people who lose their jobs, and therefore mean that though there will be a drop in disposable income, people will still have to buy essential foodstuffs and whatnot. There were a couple of things that I thought it was particularly worth highlighting. The first is, of course, the Netherlands has taken similar social distancing measures and the like, which affect the ability to do business, but it hasn't closed its external borders to other EU member states. Many of its neighbours' borders are closed, which means that in practice it's hard to move between the Netherlands and other countries, but it has taken a more liberal approach generally. This is part of the national culture, but also the very commercial-minded aspect of the Netherlands. You'll see the figures on the left are not great, 6.8% GDP loss in an low 3.4%, and significant impact on imports, 11.2% drop, and exports. Really what the Netherlands has done in response to this, and they have quite a lot of cash to do this because the Netherlands has run minimal, if any, deficits, fiscal deficits over time. The Netherlands has offered cheap loans to companies to keep them in business. They have delayed tax payments by companies, which is only useful in the short term, but is still helpful. And crucially, they have been quite generous in paying employees' salaries so long as companies keep them employed. This explains the relatively smaller increase in unemployment than some other countries have seen. So the Netherlands will have an impact, but we expect that the impact on people's pockets immediately will be a little less significant than a number of other European countries.
We start with the overview of the EU measures, and Atle, again, we welcome you to take the floor.
So I have a couple of slides. The first is fairly straightforward. As you can see, the EU's external borders are closed. The only country within the EU that this doesn't apply to is Ireland. What this means is if you are an EU citizen, you may enter. And in fact, if you have imperative reasons or very important reasons, such as you are a trucker driving a load into the EU, but also for certain sorts of healthcare workers and the like, you can enter the EU. I mean, that is the essential impact of border closure. For Ukraine, business travel is extremely limited. There are no EU level restrictions on the import of goods. There is an export restriction in place on certain personal protective equipment, things like masks and gowns for medical applications. But other than that, there's been very little impact on the regulatory side on goods. Now, what has the EU been doing with its powers, where they exist, to try and lessen the impact of COVID-19 on trade and the shipping of goods? Well, there are two buckets here. The first is on trade facilitation. DG Tax-Ud, which is the Directorate General, you can think of it as the ministry which deals with customs at the EU level, has issued significant guidance, and I'm sure, Nazar, you'll be sharing some links, and we'll make sure that the link to that guidance is included after this webinar. I mean, the most significant in some ways are, for example, on proof of preferential origin, which is important. The member states have been asked, or member states' customs authorities have been asked to accept, for example, electronic copies of certificates of origin or photocopies. There are various different simplifications, shall we say, allowed. Similarly, DG Tax-Ud has called on the member states' customs authorities, and they have been doing this, to offer flexibility on payment facilities. This includes where payment can't be made immediately or must be made in installments for tariffs and the like. There are also facilitations already available in the Union Customs Code, which DG Taxud has reminded member states of, for example, to allow presentation of goods at any place that is approved by the customs authorities. That could be presenting the goods to the customs authorities effectively remotely from the depot where they are delivered, but that will depend again on the national authorities' decision. And they've also allowed certain alternative identification measures to sealing. So as you will well know, loads normally must be sealed, but that may not be possible at present. So, for example, describing the loads clearly enough is acceptable as an alternative to sealing. All of these are things which should help traders who are importing goods into the EU, and there are other such facilitations available. The second bucket is about internal movement of goods within the EU, and this again is extremely important for you because if, for example, you are sending agricultural products for processing in the Netherlands, they have to pass through most likely Poland, then Germany to get there. And so very early on in the crisis, you saw queues, for example, at the German-Polish border of up to 24 hours, which is a problem for anyone shipping, and it's also a problem for truck drivers who can only stay at the wheel for a limited amount of time in normal circumstances. So what the EU has done there is to implement guidance which the member states have followed to designate priority green lanes for freight transport. These are literally lanes of the road which only trucks may use. These must remain open for all freight traffic. Border checks must be kept to a maximum of 15 minutes, which is helpful, though not ideal, because you would want them to be minimal, if any. And finally, member states have been urged to and have lifted, in some cases, restrictions on driving trucks on certain days of the week at certain times and the like. So the supply chains for food and other essential goods, but also for goods more generally, have been maintained thanks in part to these measures. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Atli. Again, for better understanding by our audience, these are quite important facilitating measures that the EU is offering to the member states, advising the member states. I would single out a few most important ones, I think, for our exporters. One, for Euro 1 certificates of origin, electronic copies are accepted. Second, member states are advised to designate priority lanes for freight transport, specifically for transit, green lanes. And it is advised that border checks should last no more than 15 minutes. But I have to emphasize, dear viewers, that these are guidelines, recommendations by the European authorities to the member states, and it's up to them to implement them in practice. Now, let's see how individual countries of importance to us implement these measures. And we turn back again to Poland, our neighbor, and our principal point of entry for goods and transit. I give again the floor to Marek and Stanislav.
So I will just pass over the microphone, as it were, virtually to Stanislav, who heads up our intelligence unit in CEC, who's been doing much more of the in-depth analysis and tracking of these very specific measures. And I'll pass on you, Staszek, to take our guests through this quite detailed slide.
Thank you, Marek. It's a pleasure for me to present here alongside Marek on Poland. There are a couple of most important points that are not on this slide that I have to go through. The Polish government has not yet decided when it will be stopping border checks and then when it will be resuming international flights. The current date for border checks is 12th of June, but that is likely to be extended in time, and the current date for international flights is the 23rd of May, but yet again, it is likely that this deadline is extended. Unofficially, we are hearing that June, July, perhaps end of July will be the date when the Polish government actually considers easing the main restrictions on the borders. It was already said that Poland's Visegrad Group countries, partner countries, that is Czechia and Slovakia, will be the first border crossings that Poland will ease restrictions on and only then will other borders with Germany and outside borders with Ukraine, where the easing will happen. So the Polish government wants to see how it goes with Czechia and Slovakia, and later on go to the Ukraine. But for now, the limitations are that a 14-day quarantine must be present for everyone that enters Poland. There are exceptions, of course, for truck drivers, commercial cargo truck drivers and aircrew. Entry for businessmen is allowed, but a special exemption is needed. And this system of receiving this exemption is quite complicated and requires several steps. The information here that 3 border crossings are open with Ukraine has been updated. Now it is 4 border crossings. So these discussions between Ukraine and Poland on opening borders is ongoing. The average waiting time for these borders, as we have been reported, is between 2 and 9 hours for now. And there is no limitations on export or import apart from these personal protection equipment that are so necessary in these times. In terms of goods, the Polish government has been advertising that Poles should buy Polish products, buy Polish food. But in terms of regulation, there haven't been any concrete steps to limit any importing or exporting from Poland. So that is a snapshot.
Thank you very much, Stanislav. This is very useful for our supporters to understand, particularly the time frame when we will move towards easing the traffic, and of course specific measures to alleviate the quarantine. Now we turn to France, and I give again the floor to Philippe.
Thank you, Nazar. As Atli was mentioning, what is important is the limitations that have been established about persons, because the limitations about goods are very limited as a whole in the EU. And in France too, there is to date no import or export restrictions, even if some, I would say, rather marginal and specific measures may slightly hinder transportations, but basically it's about hygienic measures about truck drivers, and it's very limited. It's a different story for persons, as in Poland and as in other countries. The close is complete and has been total since mid-March. It's something that was quite shocking for the French, because the only time we did so in the recent past was just after the famous terrorist attacks of November 2015. And so blocking, closing the borders is something that came a little bit as a shock. The borders remain closed until at least June the 15th with the countries of the European area, meaning the EU, Schengen, and the UK. And until further notice with other countries as a whole. But still there are voices that are being raised in favor of doing some kind of reopening a little bit quicker, especially with Germany, to revive economic activity, to allow companies to proceed and to work, and to be given what is described as the tools to work. But it's something that I would suspect will not happen before June the 15th, or maybe a few days earlier, but not much. There is a significant exception, that is the free movement of cross-border workers. As you may know or not, there are a lot of French people who work on a daily basis, either in Switzerland or in Luxembourg or even in Germany. It's probably 250,000 people who cross the border regularly every day. Those people enjoy a specific authorization to cross the borders. They need to show a kind of certificate that they do work on the other side of the border, but still they can cross the border, be it at the price of significant queues. I think there is not much more I would like to mention about the French case for that matter. Basically, as you've seen, the measures of quarantine are rather significant. It's difficult if you live outside of France and the EU to get back in France, to get back to France. It's more a European general a problem, as Atli was mentioning. It's a problem for the around 700,000 French people living outside of France in the EU, and all the more so for those living outside of the EU. This is something that certainly will be dealt with by the government, I would say, around somewhere in June or early July, but it's a very fluid process for the moment, and of course it depends very much on how the
Thank you very much, Philippe. Of course, France is it's a key market within the EU, together with Germany. So the measures taken by the government will be affecting both transit and eventual traffic. So now we turn to Germany, and I invite Ralf to comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Nada. Like in other countries, in Germany, panic buying was part of the people's response to the pandemic. While our neighbor France was panic buying wine and cheese, the Germans ran to buy Italian pasta and toilet paper. Vive la France, Philippe, I have to say. On our side, we show some of the major steps taken and why panic buying was absolutely unnecessary. Our 16 federal states were asked to set up a separate lane for the transport of goods for medical care and for daily necessities. Germany even lifted the Sunday and public holiday truck ban to secure the movement of goods. As traffic jams were to some extent unavoidable, the German National Railway Service also stepped it up. The Deutsche Bahn increased cooperation with neighboring countries to allow for a greater shift from the road on to the railways. Turning to the movement of persons. In March, border controls were introduced by the German Federal Ministry of the Interior. This was unfriendly and a misbehavior, since it was not coordinated with the European Union. On my chart, you see several of the steps taken during this period. For example, cross-border commuters require a note from their employer. As you may have heard, Germany had a heated debate about the need for seasonal workers, which come annually, amongst others, from Eastern Europe. Between April and now, up to 40,000 seasonal workers. Moreover, no quarantine is required for persons such as commuters or business travelers who enter and leave the country for necessary and urgent professional reasons, provided they do not show any symptoms of illness. This week, the Interior announced the easing of the restrictions. I will speak more about this in our next part. Handing back to you, Nazar.
Thank you very much, Ralf. So indeed, the measures by the German government are, given the fact that first Germany has a central geographical position in Europe, so it's important in terms of transit, and also it's again it's a key market for Ukrainian exports. Now we turn to Italy, and I invite Roberto to comment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Nazar. Very briefly, I mean, effectively, as we speak, most of the commercial activities and production activities never been really stopped. But after the decree Cura Italia, the 26th of April, most of the activities have been restarted, production activities. There is a list of about approximately 100 activities listed in that decree. As of early May, no internal restrictions are in place for goods transports, and as you know, no suspension has ever been implemented on banking services, agriculture, zootechnics, and so on and so forth. As it was said before, a different story for the people. there have been and are still in place suspension of interregional travels. In fact, we will be able to travel freely within a region as of Monday, and the decree that they should approve tonight will give us permission to travel between regions, among regions, as of the 3rd of June. There is a whole set of other measures included in Cura Italia related to the use of individual protection devices, smart working, prolonging the working hours of public offices and others to allow the spread of the traffic. There has been several degree of relaxation of these measures. And as far as air is controlled, that would deserve a completely separate type of discussion. We'll probably do it in the next slide when we look into the reopening. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roberto. So summing up for our audience, it is important that production in Italy was, limits to production were minimal. So basically it limited the economic, the fall of GDP to a considerable extent. And we also very much will follow with great interest how the Italian government is easing the restrictions on movement of person, including business travel where possible, because that would mean a certain light in the end of the tunnel for resumption of economic activities. That is important for our exporters. Now we turn to the Netherlands, and I give the floor to Atli.
Thanks, Nazar. Closing this section off, there were only a few things that I thought were relevant that go beyond what we've heard for the other countries, because across the EU this is broadly similar. You won't be surprised to hear that, as I said before, the Netherlands has been fairly liberal in what it has done in terms of restrictions of movements. For persons, as I said before, they haven't closed internal borders with the EU. In fact, Schiphol Airport has still been running, though of course at a limited rate, and a number of those EU citizens returning to the European Union, even to other countries, have had to come in through Schiphol because it is one of those more active airports. If you are coming into the EU from an at-risk zone, or indeed coming into the Netherlands from another part of the EU which is considered at risk, then you would be subject to health screening before you boarded that flight. Now, crucially for Ukrainian business, as I said before, the Netherlands does not stop, for example, truckers bringing goods into the country. In fact, the Netherlands has also ensured that the Port of Rotterdam remained fully operational. I spoke to someone who works in their SPS service only yesterday, and he told me that it's been very quiet, but most of what they typically do on paperwork has been moved to digital. So that has been a very important source of imports to the EU, both pharmaceutical and the like, but also food imports. Back to you, Nazar.
Thank you very much, Atli. And now we turn to the last segment of our presentation, measures that have been taken to ease and quit the quarantine. We first start with an overview of the EU institutions' guidelines, recommendations to member states. And Atli, I'm again asking you to take the floor. Thank you.
Thanks, Nazar. I'm back to back. Now, so there are two stories here when it comes to EU guidance. The first is that at the start of the crisis, the EU was quite slow to adopt guidance. And in fact, member states started closing borders internally, started imposing quarantine or lockdown measures without much, if any, coordination. And Ralph, in fact, rightly pointed out that, you know, closing borders with your direct neighbors without having consulted with them is a little unusual, to say the least, in the European context. So the EU decided that it needed to take some sort of control, and it issued guidance on how to exit the quarantine on April 15. This lays out a very gradual approach where member states are expected to coordinate with one another, but it has not been particularly strongly heard, shall we say. Member states continue to do what they think is right. Now, on Wednesday this week, the EU issued a whole series of guidance documents which may be more effective, shall we say, in calling for action by the member states. These are on various areas around tourism and travel. There's an overarching communication on tourism and travel, which essentially says, well, we hope that you will be able to come on holiday to holiday destinations in the EU later this year, though you may have to be a few meters apart if you go to the beach. I've heard, for example, that of countries which are not covered in this presentation, but may be interesting to you from a holiday standpoint, Spain and Greece are extremely keen that the international borders be lifted on June 15, which is the current proposed date for the European border closure, so that they can start welcoming tourists back to their beaches. So by all means, if you are planning to come to Spain in August, that may well be possible. But to go back to more concrete things, transport services, the EU sets up various guidelines for ensuring that, for example, flights or rail service or other sorts of transport are safe to take, and that people will feel that they are safe to take. Now, again, this is very general, it's not binding. Throughout, the EU encourages a gradual approach that is coordinated, and crucially, it envisages that internal border restrictions, internal travel restrictions and the like should be lifted before international ones are.
Thank you very much, Atli. A very brief takeaway from this presentation for our exporters, for our audience to understand. Unfortunately, indeed, the individual countries take the lead in this unprecedented situation. Unfortunately, at the EU level, coordination has been not to the extent everyone wanted. But from our point of view, what our exporters and business must keep in mind are the dates. Tentative preliminary date is June 15 to exit the quarantine, and May 13 for opening internal borders within the EU. But we should keep in mind that the dates are preliminary, and they may change if the situation with the infections change. Now we go again to individual countries to see how in practice things are improving, and we go back again to our neighbor and our principal business partner, Poland. Marek?
Yes, thank you, Nazar. I mentioned earlier that Poland had introduced strict restrictions early, but it was already in the process of lifting those restrictions. And I'll ask Staszek now to review that with you in more detail. Staszek.
Thank you. So what the Polish government is setting out to do is to actually reopen the economy internally, see how that goes in terms of spikes in infection rate and places in available hospital beds. And only after this, in mid-June or even July, it will consider easing international travel restrictions. So as of this Monday, the Monday after the weekend, restaurants and hairdressers will be open, which I do need desperately. And that last stage is coming on June 1st with gyms, cinemas, and a final wave of services. There is no official announcements as to the next steps of easing after that, but the situation in Poland in terms of the spread of the pandemic is very good. There is one exception. It is the mining region of Silesia, which has been the epicenter of the pandemic in Poland for the past 2 weeks. But if that region is taken out of the view, Poland has basically gone through the pandemic already. You may have heard the news that in Slovenia, the pandemic is over and there is no new COVID cases, and it is very similar for all countries in Eastern Europe. Czechia, Slovakia, Croatia, and Poland is also on that path. Now, the Polish Ministry of Health has been repeating every single news conference that the pandemic will return in autumn. So it is keeping those regulations ready to implement at any stage that the infection rate is spiking, and actually experts in Poland are saying that there will be a return of the pandemic in the autumn. So this opening of borders and setting it for a final opening of when everything is going to work is very hard to predict, as the Ministry of Health is actually pushing for quite careful steps in terms of international travel and easing travel restrictions. But internally, the Polish economy will be back on track with new social isolation rules for every type of service. And we will actually see whether the Polish people will adhere to these regulations. They have been doing thus far, but the summer weather is maybe not going to be helpful with that. So that is it for Poland and what we know about the time of easing restrictions.
Thank you very much, Stanislav. A very brief summary on this. First, it's very good to see that our neighbor is going relatively quickly through the pandemic and is about to open up for business again. It's very important for our businesses, for our exporters to understand, but also another side of the story is that the Polish government is very careful about setting the stages for easing travel restrictions, including international one. And of course, we should understand that things may change. It's a dynamic situation. So our businesses, our exporters should not get too quickly too optimistic. Now we turn to France, and I invite Philippe to share with us your insight.
Thank you, Nazar. I won't be long. I think your timeline speaks for itself, basically. Just two caveats to start with. First, it's very fluid. That is, it can change, as I was mentioning earlier, any minute if there is if bad figures appear showing that there is what everyone is fearing as a second wave. But for the moment, that's the timeline that has been established by the government. The second caveat is that as I was also saying earlier, we just went out on last Monday only of 55 days of rather strict lockdown, which of course has left the economic scarces that we have mentioned earlier. And so it's important that we keep going along this line, but it's far from being certain, and a lot depends on how the population behaves. Very shortly, something is important in France, you know, and not only as Ralph was mentioning earlier, wine and cheese, but also holidays. And the Prime Minister mentioned yesterday that the French were, authorized to make the bookings for their summer holidays, because the wide expectation is that even if a second wave is expected, it should normally be avoided. So since yesterday, the French know that normally they will be able to go on holidays. Last Monday only, May on the 11th, we reopened elementary school. That's the left of the timeline. The next important step is June the 15th, where we both may have, hopefully, the reopening of bars and restaurants. Today, all small shops and many large shops are reopened, are open again, but not the largest shops. Typically, Galeries Lafayette is not open, and not bars and restaurants, which, as you know, is very painful for the French, because tourism is a very important ingredient of our economy. So having bars and restaurants and, of course, hotels closed is really painful economically. So there is a wide expectation that June 15 is indeed the date for the reopening of bars and restaurants, and probably hotels will follow a few weeks afterwards. June 15th is important also because, as mentioned earlier, it's normally the date for reopening intra-European borders, except if there is a particular agreement made with Germany a few days earlier, which might or might not happen. And then you see the rest of the timeline. Hopefully, at the end of this timeline, we should also enter an area where we could expect some kind of gradual reopening of traffic to and from out of the EU, Schengen, UK area borders. So we we can hope for something like that happening in August, but at this time it's much too early to mention any kind of precise date, and certainly the government has not mentioned anything for that matter for the moment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Philippe. So for our audience, it's important to keep in mind a few dates which are crucial, potentially important for resumption of business activities in France. This is June 15, possibly, and also the beginning of July. But again, we fully understand the carefulness of the French government. And of course, our audience, our viewers should understand that this is very much preliminary and may be changed in the future. Now we turn back to France's neighbor and the economic heartland of Europe, Germany. Ralph, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nazar. Germany has been planning to ease existing measures. The timeline on the slide gives you a very rough idea of some of the aims. Germany, as you know, has a federalistic system, and our Chancellor Angela Merkel is known to keep everything under control in crisis situations. But it has now been agreed that the individual 16 federal states are in charge of gradually easing measures. It was also agreed between the Chancellor and the 16 prime ministers of our Länder that should one find increasing infections rates, one would immediately reinstall restrictions. We therefore expect a patchwork situation between the different federal states and even within our federal states, since the communities and the health institution of our municipal level is in charge in the future. This weekend, the border with Luxembourg will be reopened. Controls with France, Switzerland and Austria are to continue until mid-June, but only random controls. We therefore hope that we will see the end of all border controls from the 15th of June onwards. The most recent government quote from Poland states that they are, start of quote, thinking about stopping some border controls in June or July, end of quote. As you can see, large events continue to be prohibited in Germany until August 31st. Let's turn to something more positive. The Federal Foreign Office has issued a worldwide travel warning until the 14th of June, and our federal government strongly advised to cancel all non-essential travel. Yet we also hear that from the 15th of June, we want to open all borders again, including to third countries like Ukraine. In the meantime, I'm pleased to be able to visit restaurants with my family again in Berlin this weekend after nearly 2 months. So bars and restaurants are open again, and that's good news. Back to you, Nazar.
Yes, thank you very much, Ralph. I think we are very much in solidarity with you here in Kiev and across cities in Ukraine. We all look forward to get out of this limbo. So for our businesses, 2 dates to understand as far as Germany is concerned. It's the May 15. It's the easing process for internal border traffic starts. And then June 14-15, it's a possible date for easing international, including business travel from and to Germany. And another thing to understand very well for our businesses is that quarantine easing measures in Germany will be decentralized. It will be in the hands of federal states. So we have to watch on each in our business relationship how individual federal state in Germany affairs in terms of easing the quarantine. Now we turn to Italy, and I ask our colleague Roberto to comment.
Thank you, Nazar. This is a very simple slide, actually, but it tells you exactly how Italians are managing this crisis. Again, I refer to the main one of the 4 measures taken by the government. Regions have to monitor their epidemiological development daily, and they have to work hand in hand with the central authorities. Now, on what criteria and why? The criteria is very simple. There's only one criteria, which is so-called RT or R0, which is the index of transmission of the disease. This should be below 1 to decrease the epidemics. Overall in Italy is around 0.2, 0.3, so it's going very well, except for region and particularly in Lombardy. Now, why is that important? Because regionally, historically, the healthcare budget and the healthcare ministry is driving here. The healthcare budget is regionalized. So they are responsible for their budget and for all the necessary measures. So they have to detect the trend of the epidemiology, propose to the central government further restriction measures at local level. And on top of that, bi-weekly, there is a national review. So what is happening here is we are zoning Italy. It's pretty much what people in the audience working in the agriculture or in zootechnics knows very, very well. We are zoning Italy to allow higher relaxation in the other areas. But this is, of course, a joint responsibility of the regional authorities and the central authorities, and this is very fluid. Now, the decree which is in discussion as we speak in the government will further relax situations from next Monday in terms of inter-regional travels and from the 3rd of June among regions. On airlines, actually, it might be worth mentioning a few things. We do not see any major relaxation as well before the 15th of June. The Italian Minister of Health took an extremely strong stand, and so the head of the crisis unit, Colau. Now, proposing, one passenger per row in the airplane, something which is totally unsustainable. There has been a very heavy lobbying, and we seem to see the light of the day as we speak. So probably we'll come to some more sustainable measures by the middle of June. But as also Philippe said, the situation is fluid and it might change. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Roberto. So again, for our business to understand the situation in Italy, again, we have also here a regional approach, a zoning, which is important to understand for your direct business relationship with Italian partners. Second, very important thing to understand that we have this regular bi-weekly national review that may change the situation pretty fast. And of course, the considerations as far as the air travel is concerned should be taken into account by our audience. Now we go to the Netherlands, and I'm asking Adli to comment.
Thank you, Nazar. The Netherlands has taken a fairly straightforward approach. As you can see, they, since May 11th, have reopened a number of businesses, including those that require physical contact. In fact, for your joy, you may wish to know that hairdressers were allowed to open at midnight on May 11th, and there were reports of queues in front of hairdressers in a number of cities in the Netherlands, as men in particular who had grown long hair in the quarantine time really were very, very keen to get it cut. So that's a funny detail. Thereafter, you see effectively a month-by-month relaxation for the next couple of months. So June 1st, you have the reopening of most businesses, in fact, including cinemas and restaurants and the like, but with a maximum of 30 customers. That is irrespective of the size of the business. So that means for small restaurants, it makes very little difference. For large restaurants, they will have tables farther apart. And then on July 1st, you will have a number of other reopenings, including of of camping grounds, which is a very important diversion for the Dutch, but also allowing restaurants to have up to 100 customers. And there's a catch-all stage back in September for those sort of businesses which are considered either less crucial or where you have a significant contact and therefore greater risk of transferring the virus.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Atle. That was also very useful to understand how the Dutch government is going to address and to do it in a timeline fashion. Now we have completed our 3 modules of presentations. Now it's the time for a Q&A session with our experts. But before we do this, I'm very pleased to announce that Deputy Minister, Ukraine Trade Representative Taras Kachka, is with us as a viewer, and it is my pleasure, if he wishes so, to give him a floor to share his insights and views and greetings to our audience. Taras?
It was a pleasure for me to listen to your presentation from every one of you, and I think that I cannot add anything new to it, except for maybe Ukrainian experience that we started to lift certain lockdown rules embedded in a resolution of government 211 to 211, and there are more and more let's say freedoms reintroduced, freedoms of movement, but at the same time we still have certain limitation on especially in transportation area and border crossing. Another good news is that we started to lift the bans on the export of products, so that this week, so today, the prohibition of export of medicine spiritus is ended, is over. We shortened the period of ban, so because it was envisaged that it will be prohibited till the 1st of June, but we shortened this period because we see that the internal market is more or less flexible and balanced, and we can supply medicine spiritus for the production of disinfectors in the EU and worldwide without any stresses for domestic market. So as well, we are now collecting information about the necessity to continue the export ban on individual protective equipment like masks and others. But in our opinion, that there will be no necessity to prohibit this, and we will start to trade with these products in normal way. And as well, the only food product which was covered by export ban, the buckwheat, we are now trying to figure out whether we have a possibility to shorten the period of this export ban, because it is envisaged that this export ban is enforced till the 1st of July, and we want to shorten this by a couple of weeks, just to show that in reality we are ready to. So our interest is to resume international trade as international trade in normal way. So I think that we are all in the same situation when logistics becomes let's say cornerstone of international trade, not duties or trade limitation, but logistics. And we see how easily international trade becomes dependent on the possibility to transport goods and products. And I think that the only solution for this is coordination, because I still remember one of examples in the early day of lockdown when we found out that a shipment, or so that the cargo of small pigs has been blocked on Ukrainian-Moldavian border because of sanitary measures of closing border, and it requires intervention of me and head of customs service and head of food safety agency to unblock the one shipment. But however ridiculous these stories might be, in reality, this is the only way to ensure that international trade operates in more or less normal way, or to the extent possible, within lockdown. And your presentation actually shows that this is the only practical way, just to coordinate, to exchange information, and ensure that there is a possibility to find individual decisions in particular cases if necessary, in order to ensure the proper flow of goods. So therefore, in my opinion, this kind of initiative should be really systemic and regular, and this year will be under this kind of, let's say, managed trade from logistical point of view. We might hate this term, managed trade, because trade should be as free as possible. But now this meaning, earlier this term that controlled or managed trade was rather the term used for Trump policy on regulating trade, with volumes to be sold to China or to bought by the EU. And we tried to oppose this. And now, unfortunately, this term is rather rational solution for maintaining trade within the situation of pandemic. So, in my opinion, that we need to tackle this reality by exchanging views, exchanging information on a regular basis. Therefore, I welcome this kind of initiatives, and I hope that there will be a lot of news about new bans lifted and new freedoms reinstalled within the course of exiting from coronavirus this year, and the reinstallation of normal trade conditions on continent. So thank you for this, and I think that we are all in the same framework, and we need to coordinate and ensure proper interoperability between our, let's say, logistical frameworks, both Ukraine and the member states of the EU. So thank you, and I welcome this initiative. It was extremely interesting for me to listen to this presentation. Thank you.
We have received more than 60 questions from during the registration to this webinar. So for obvious reasons, I hope you understand that it will not be possible for us to answer all these questions now. We'll be taking these questions along, and we'll send you back answers to the extent we can and how they are relevant to this webinar. And we have selected a few questions which, in our opinion, are the most important to our business, to our exporters, which are relevant to how they can trade with the EU, with European countries in these circumstances. So the first question, which in fact Taras already referred to, is whether there are any coronavirus specific sanitary or phytosanitary restrictions on imports of goods from countries like Ukraine to the EU, with special emphasis on, for instance, either dairy, milk products, or honey, or fruits, vegetables, or organic products. Since this is the issue which is regulated at the level of European Union by EU law, I would like to ask Atli if he can share his view on this matter. Atli?
Thank you, Nazar. I mean, I'm not aware of any such measures in the EU, and that would stand to reason for one essential reason, which is, as far as we know, and as far as the WHO has stated in published reports, there are no documented cases of transfer from animals to humans, other than the supposition that, of course, coronavirus came ultimately from bats, possibly through another host. Now, what that means is that though some people seem to have passed COVID-19 or the coronavirus onto their cats, you're not going to pass it to a cow and back, whether through meat or through milk. And so there is no scientific basis at present for such measures. Of course, if the scientific understanding changes, then there may be measures brought in.
Thank you. Thank you, Atli. A very quick second question, which is very much related to this one, and which may be of great interest to our exporters. Does the EU rules offer any customs facilitation for exporters? For instance, to confirm origin of goods. You mentioned that in your presentation, but if you could briefly again recapitulate it, repeat for our audience.
Of course, with great pleasure. As I said in my presentation on customs facilitation, there is guidance issued by DG Tax-Ud to member states asking that they accept essentially contactless forms of providing this, the relevant information for rules of origin in particular. This means that you can provide it by electronic means or copies which you then leave with the customs authorities so they don't have to be handled repeatedly. I mean, so there are those sorts of things in place. More broadly, the EU customs system is trying to use all of the flexibility that is available under the Union Customs Code. I highly urge you to look at the site if you have customs questions, the site of DG Tax-Ud, and specifically the page that they've set up with customs issues arising from COVID-19. They have, for example, a table of all of the member states' practice on whether they accept electronic declarations of origin, which is very useful. They have, an explanation, though it is quite technical, referring, of course, to the relevant articles, of the flexibility that is available and the flexibility that they simply can't give, even though it would be useful because it's unlawful, for example, on temporary storage after goods have been admitted temporarily. So there is a lot of information out there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Atli. And the last question that from our audience that we thought was very much relevant for everyone is about, let's say, preferential terms or encouragements for imports of particular products that, let's say, are in really big demand now because of the coronavirus pandemics. We talk about, of course, the imports of antiseptics and their ingredients into the EU. I think it has already been briefly mentioned during the presentations, but I invite all speakers to briefly let us know whether either at the national level or perhaps at the EU level there have been any signals that give preference, encourage imports of such products into the EU, and whether our exporters can take advantage of that.
Perhaps briefly at the EU level, I'm not aware of any specific ones, but I think this is more the sort of thing which might be encouraged at the national level.
Yeah, I mean, if I may add something here, this is Roberto from Italy. I totally agree with Atli, actually. We have to try to interpret the wind, so to speak. I mean, in March, I guess it was March 24, the European Chemical Agency, the HCHA, declared a support for the EU authorities to apply derogations for biocides products. However, just a week later, 2 weeks later, I mean, in early April, following discussion with the Commission and national authority, it has been decided not to issue a sort of centralized submission to ECHA for application, covering several countries. So in a way, there has been an attempt to streamline the process, but this, as Atli was saying, has not yet delivered anything of substance and very much remains at national level. We can see it on the import ban or export ban of biocide and antiseptics from each country. Everybody seems to be moving with a different pace.
Yeah, it's also worth saying perhaps that there have been measures in specific countries taken by business to shift production, for example, from beer. Beer sales have been hit quite badly because people are no longer going to bars, for example, in Belgium, where I am. And so major brewers have switched over to producing ethanol for for the purposes of making hand sanitizers and the like. So, you know, you've seen business react more than specifically, should we say, government intervention.
If I may, Philippe, Mania speaking from Paris, that's an important point that Minister Kashka himself touched upon earlier. And just as Zatli was mentioning, a lot of local businesses have invested into producing this kind of products. So the only thing we have in France is nothing that will help our Ukrainian friends who may hope to export such products into the EU and particularly into France. But there was a special decree taken in France that introduces exemptions under regulations in terms of manufacturing these disinfectors, these hydroalcoholic products. And a small anecdote, a lot of businesses have rushed into this business to show they care in a way. And so, for example, Louis Vuitton handbags, the famous LVMH subsidiary, has transformed, probably temporarily, I suppose, but one of its chains into producing this kind of products. But again, it's very local. It's very associated to, you know, brand boasting in a way, and there is nothing like opening the borders to these kind of products that would be manufactured outside.
In Germany, I have to add that our Federal Ministry of Health received new possibilities to take measures to get the necessary medical supplies, such as antiseptic, in new audiences that have been finalized in March and April. However, I'm not aware of any specific call to import antiseptics and related ingredients, I have to add.
Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone. This closes our webinar for today. I would like to thank our speakers for their contributions, which really, in my opinion, gave important information. They shed light for our businesses, for our audience, about what we should expect, what's going on in terms of economy in the EU, what are the remaining measures that limit trade and transit, and what we should expect in terms of getting back to normal. So I remind our audience that я хотів би нагадати ще раз нашій аудиторії, що цей вебінар тільки один з перший з серії заходів, івентів, які Українська асоціація бізнесу і торгівлі буде готувати впродовж травня і червня для нашої аудиторії, з тим, щоб допомагати нашому бізнесу краще орієнтуватися на європейському ринку. Для нас дуже важливий також ваш зворотній зв'язок, ваші коментарі, зауваження, побажання щодо більш конкретних тем, спікерів, країн. Тому просимо вас відвідувати нашу Фейсбук-сторінку і наш веб-сайт за адресою ubta.com.ua і стежити за нашими наступними заходами. Thank you very much our speakers for your contribution. І я також дякую Expert Promotion Office за їхню можливість, за цю можливість звернутися і допомагати спілкуватися з нашим бізнесом. Дякую.